G'day, legends. Have you ever wondered how a hybrid mixing setup works? How do we use plugins and hardware at the same time? Well, I'm going to show you my setup and how I do this within Logic, and most importantly, how I do this without having any latency issues, because if you don't set this up correctly, you can end up delaying the signal when it does its round trip out through the gear and back into your DAW, and that's not what you want. You want everything to just be synced up perfectly while you're using your outboard gear. So there's kind of two methods to this madness. The first one is that you will run a signal out through a piece of gear, let's say drums, through a stereo compressor, and we leave that set up. We dial it in, and then we can always come back and we can tweak it. But what this means is every time that we come back to the session, we have to recall the settings on that piece of gear. So you have to keep a note of all of your settings so that you can bring them back up each time you come back to the session. It's kind of painful, but that is the price of using outboard gear sometimes. Now, the other option is you take a sound, you run it out through a piece of gear, and then you print it straight back into your DAW, and then you no longer need that piece of gear anymore. So I'm going to show you both methods and how to do it without any issues with latency. So for that first method of using outboard gear, setting it up and just keeping it in the session, what we're going to do is apply a stereo compressor to our drum bus. So this is what the drums sound like at the moment. Just some nice, simple brush style drumming. Now on my drum bus, I'm going to load up the Logic in-out plugin. So come down to utility, go to IO, and then hit stereo because we're on a stereo bus. Now we open this up. What we need to do is select our outputs. Now on the back of your interface, there's going to be a bunch of outputs, assuming you have an interface with multiple outputs. If you don't, you're not going to be able to do this. You'll need to upgrade your interface. So most interfaces have a couple extra outputs. For example, my Universal Audio Apollo Twin, it has outputs 3 and 4. So outputs 1 and 2 go to the monitors usually, and then you have your extra outputs. So on the back of my SSL 18 and my Alpha 8 and then my Octo Pre, I have all of these outputs. I've got a ton of outputs that I can use. So it really depends on your interface, how many outputs you're going to have. But what I'm going to do is run out of output 5 and 6 on the back of my SSL 18. And you can see I've labeled this for my Audioscape decomp. Now on the way back in, we're going to come back in on inputs 5 and 6. You can literally come back in on any input you want, but just to keep things kind of simple, I like to keep the numbering the same. So we go output 5 and 6, we come in on input 5 and 6, just keeps it streamlined, especially when you're using lots of pieces of gear all at once. Now this is where our setups may differ. On the back of my SSL 18 is where all of the outputs are, and all of those are being hooked into my patch bay. So if you don't have a patch bay, you just plug straight into the back of your interface for this. But I have all of the outputs hooked into my patch bay, so I don't have to reach around underneath and plug into the back of this. I can just plug in to one of these slots here. So for me, output 5 and 6 is right here. Now I'm going to take output 5 and I'm going to come down here. This is where the input of my Audioscape decomp is. Then I'm going to do the same thing, take output 6 and run it into the right input of my decomp. Same deal, if you don't have a patch bay, just run the cable straight from the output into the input of your compressor. Now I have the outputs of the decomp hooked up to this slot here on my patch bay. So I'm going to take the output of the left channel here, and I'm going to run that to input 5 on my interface, which is this one here. This is going into input 5. Then I'm going to take the right output of my decomp, which is this channel here, and plug that into the input 6 of my interface. So we're coming from output 5 and 6 on our interface into the inputs of our decomp compressor, and then we're coming out of our decomp compressor into inputs 5 and 6 on our interface. So it's like this big loop out and then back in. Again, if you don't have a patch bay, you literally just go from the outputs of your interface into your compressor and then back out of the compressor into the inputs of your interface. And then all that's left to do is dial that compressor in and enjoy the way it sounds. Okay, pretty cool and pretty straightforward, right? Once you've got it all set up like this, all you need to do is hit that latency detection ping button to make sure that Logic accounts for any latency that's going to happen from the round trip out into the piece of the gear and then back into the DAW. So you can see we've got a +9 sample rate just there. That means that Logic is now going to add that compensation so that there's no delay to our signal. You can hear how nice that decomp sounds on those drums, really bringing them to life. Now, it's not too complicated. The setup's pretty straightforward. Hopefully the patch bay didn't confuse you. The patch bay just acts as a junction for someone like me who has a bunch of gear. So I have all of the inputs, all of the outputs hooked up over here so that I don't have to crawl around behind the back of my desk to patch things together. I can literally do it right here, hence the name patch bay. So that's our first method, just having a piece of gear sitting there and running anytime we're working on the mix. Fully tweakable, can come back and change it at any point. But what if we want to print a sound back into our DAW? How do we go about doing that, and how do we do it without having any latency issues? So let me show you how I go about doing this. So for this example, we're going to use a banjo and we're going to compress it a little bit, and then we're going to print that straight back in. So this is what it sounds like at the moment. Cute little banjo part. Now we're going to grab Logic's in-out plugin again, this time just in mono, and we're going to send this out of output 7, and we're going to come back in on input 7. Now, same deal on the patch bay. I'm going to take output 7, I'm going to run it into my warm audio 76, which is just down here, and then I'm going to take the output of that and send it back in through input 7 on the interface. Exactly the same way that we set it up with the decomp. Now, I've already dialed in these settings on the compressor. I'm using an 8:1 ratio. The banjo is pretty plucky, so going with a higher ratio just to tame that a little bit. I've got the attack time at about 10 o'clock and the release time at about 2 o'clock. This is a fairly smooth attack and release time on an 1176. Now, what I found was the signal was hitting the compressor pretty hard without any input, so I have pulled the output volume back on the in-out. So I brought that down about 5 dBs, and that started reacting a lot nicer with the compressor. So sometimes you may need to adjust your output volume if it's coming out a little too hot or if it's a little too quiet. You maybe need to feed it in a little bit more into the compressor. So let's check out what this sounds like. Sounds like a banjo, but a less dynamic one now. Now, what we want to do is print this back into our DAW. I don't want to leave this running. I don't want to keep an 1176 up every time I open this session. I want to take that compression and hard write it to this sound. So when I first did this, I didn't really know exactly how to go about doing this. So my first instinct was, well, we're sending it out of output 7. We will just record it back in through input 7. So let's try that now real quick. So on the input, let's just put this back to nothing because we don't want to bring the input back in on the plugin. We want to set up a new channel and record this in. So I'm going to change that to none. So now this is only sending it out. Okay, so I've got an empty channel here. What I'm going to do is change the input to input 7. Now if I arm the track and press play, we should hear it. All right, cool, it's coming through. So it's going through our in-out plugin to output 7, and now I've set up a new channel and I'm recording it back in through input 7 on the interface. How does it sound in the context of the mix? Is it in time still? All right, sounds pretty good. Let's hit record now and see how it goes. I can already see a problem just by looking at this. Look at our audio up the top here. This is what we just sent out, and this is what we're receiving back in. They're definitely not in the same position anymore. Look at that transient. It's actually really quite far away. So that hasn't worked, even though it sounded all right. What if we listen to it now that it's captured back into the DAW? See, that's just weird. It's weird that you can play it back while the track's armed, hear it coming back in perfectly in time. As soon as you hit record, it goes out of sync. It's very annoying. Now, what if we put it into low latency mode? Maybe that's the issue. So in Logic, we've got low latency mode. We'll click this on. It accounts for any like plugins and things that are just causing, latency in the session. Let's try it again with that and see if it does a better job. It's not even working now because low latency mode is turning off our in-out plugin. So you're like, geez, well, do I just record it and then nudge it over? You can do that. It's a pain, but you can. Otherwise, the method I'm going to show you right here fixes this issue and you won't have any latency problems, but it does involve a little bit of routing. Turn low latency mode off. Now let's open the in-out plugin again and let's bring that input back to input 7. So now our signal is coming back in on that channel again. Okay, so now what we need to do is we're going to change the output of the channel. At the moment, I've got this sent to my mix bus, which is bus 32, but I'm going to just send it to an empty bus. So bus 29 has nothing on it, so let's use that. Now I'm going to come over to bus 29 over here, and because this is a mono track, I'm going to change this to a mono bus. That's just by clicking on that little circle at the top. And then I'm going to change the output to no output. So now we're sending our signal to this bus, and we're not going to be able to hear it because the output's turned off. Okay, and let's just label this bus as print. Okay, so that's the sound that we're going to print. Now, let's come back to that channel that we created to print the signal back in. And this time, we're going to select the input as bus 29, which you can see has our banjo going to it. Now, we can do the same thing. We arm the track, put it into record, and if we solo these and play them, we should hear that banjo coming through. Okay, so you're probably like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? It seems bizarre, right? But by taking the signal out of Logic, back in on the in-out plugin, it accounts for the latency, and then we can route it to a bus, and then we can record that bus. And Logic at the same time is accounting for all of this latency that's going on. Now, have a listen and watch what happens as we hit record now. Okay, let's zoom in and see how well this has worked now. Now we can see this looks way better already. We can come right in and see everything looks pretty good. I reckon if we get really close, there might be a small difference. You can see a really fractional difference in that latency. And again, if you wanted to, you could come in here and you could just shift it over a tiny bit. But in the grand scheme of things, if you're just processing a mono signal, that's not going to be an issue. Maybe if you're processing a multi-mic setup that has phase relationships going on, you might want to come in and check that stuff afterwards anyway, but I wouldn't even bother doing that if I was printing this banjo back in. That's fine. You can hear when you play it back, it still sounds perfectly in time. Pretty cool, right? Now I've got my nicely controlled banjo signal right there, compressed, sounding really good in the mix. You can see we've got some real nice big peaks up here on the original signal, and down here it just looks a lot more consistent. So that's the beauty of compression, which, you do with plugins and whatever, but if you love hardware gear, it is cool to use it. And this is how you can go about sending it out, printing it back in without any issues of latency. So ultimately, you don't need a fancy patch bay. You don't need heaps of stuff. You just need an interface that has multiple outputs on the back of it to be able to start your journey into using outboard gear. If you guys enjoyed and found this video helpful, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support this channel, make sure you go and check out my merch store. I've got a bunch of shirts, tees, jumpers, a bunch of cool stuff over there, as well as jump over to my website and check out my range of drum sample packs and mixing courses. Grabbing any of that stuff is massive support for this channel. And if you're interested in checking out my Trigger 2 drum sample pack, and check out this next video coming up.